Joining us this morning, Elevation Partners co-founder Roger McNamee is with us. Roger, of course, an early investor in Facebook and Google. Roger, great to see you again. Thanks for being with us, as always.
Carl, it's a pleasure to be here.
I'd love to know what's going through your head right now as you sort of survey the last 90 days in the price action. I know you think it's about more than just poaching between Meta and OpenAI.
Well, exactly. And Carl, I think investors are excited about AI because the promise of it is so huge that it would revolutionize the economy and do a lot of things that investors have liked for a long time, reducing employment, increasing profit margins, and the like. The thing that investors have not focused on, though, is how this plays out from an industry point of view. Today, there are at least 5 major AI development efforts in big tech, right? You have Microsoft with OpenAI, you have Google, you have Amazon, you have Meta, and you have xAI. They're all essentially doing the same thing. They're all essentially in the same place. And collectively, they will have invested about $600 billion by the end of this year. Reports for next year are they're going to invest way more than that, maybe even as much as $1 trillion. And the real question, people should be looking at this the way Jack Welch would have and ask, well, wait a minute, how many winners are there likely to be? I mean, history suggests that in large market opportunities, there are 2 significant winners and maybe a third guy who can make it. Well, if Microsoft and OpenAI stop being partners, then there are 6 essentially identical development efforts, which means at least 3 of those guys are going to fail. And I don't mean fail a little. I mean fail to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars of write-offs. And I don't think that that's a speculative point. I mean, I think that's just how markets develop. And that's assuming the industry is successful. Then you have to look at DeepSeek, the Chinese effort, which for what, 1% of the capital of the other guys, developed something that's functionally equivalent. And it doesn't really matter how they got there. The big point about DeepSeek is that potentially LLMs are a commodity, which means that all this money being poured in will never get an appropriate rate of return. And right. I think investors should begin to focus on that.
Do you think Microsoft in particular is beginning to show signs of whatever you want to call it, fiscal discipline, operations discipline, given the competitive race you put up?
Carl, it's really hard to tell because they're in so deep. I don't know how they get out. You know, they're putting Copilot, which is their consumer-facing AI tool set, into essentially every product in their enterprise application suite. And I don't know how they get out from underneath that. They are slowing down the rate of investment, but they have so much invested to this point. And I do expect them to be a winner. I do think at the end of the day, the winners are going to be the people who can spend the most money because there's going to be very little distinction among the products. And candidly, when you look at the field tests of this stuff, none of it's working particularly well. So I do think the guys with the best pitch, and right now that's Microsoft and OpenAI, are likely to emerge as winners. But X has an inside track at least some government contracts. You know, so the question you have to ask is, what happens to Google? What happens to Amazon? What happens to Meta? I don't think poaching people from other places is going to save those folks. The issue that they all face, in Meta's case and Amazon's case, they have huge cloud services operations. But if the industry goes from 6 players down to, say, 2, you're not going to need as much cloud services. So I think everybody gets hurt.
What do you think overall, Roger, the impact of this phenomenon will be on GDP when the dust settles? Do you think it is a foregone conclusion that this AI will increase productivity, or do you think there's some potential, thought that needs to be put into what it means for jobs and, people's livelihoods and so forth?
There's no question that the bull case for AI comes at the cost of tens of millions of jobs. And the question is, what are you going to do with all those people? And what's going to happen to demand in aggregate? I mean, making your company incredibly efficient while getting rid of all your customers seems like a bad trade. You know, economies do require some inefficiency. They require some friction, both for resilience and also to make sure that they're buyers for whatever it is you're selling. And I do think the shtick of the AI guys is, on the one hand, we're going to destroy humanity. On the other hand, we're going to take away all the jobs. But somehow that's going to be good. And I'm looking at this and going, well, maybe, but probably not.
Do you think that friction is solved through market forces? Are the tech companies going to be able to police themselves? Or do you think there needs to be more and better regulation that can try and strike that balance over time?
Yeah, to be clear, I don't think there's a prayer there's going to be any regulation. And, I do think that what these companies have done, and I think Altman at OpenAI has been a master of this, is that they have spun a tale and they have gotten politicians, CEOs, journalists, and investors to buy into this thing without spending a lot of time thinking about whether it's going to work. Everybody should go back and watch the classic film, The Sting, with Paul Newman. You just need to remind yourself how a really big con works. And I don't think there's ever been a more successful pitch of fantasy to a more strategic group of marks than you've seen with this technology. And I really tip my hat to these people. I mean, tech's been exaggerating what it can do for decades, but it was always by 5, 10, 15%. This notion that you would promise something that you couldn't possibly deliver and that everybody would buy that, even as the evidence came in that it doesn't work that well, that part is really amazing to me. And, I don't know how this thing shakes out. What I do think is that it's too late to stop it. So we're going to play the whole thing out. And the question is, what does that do to market caps of big tech, particularly for the guys whose products don't succeed in the marketplace?
What about, in terms of investing frameworks, are you more confident in, say, an infrastructure build-out playbook where you don't have to bet on one or two winners?
Carl, that's a great question. The one observation I'd make is back in the early 90s, when SAP put out the first enterprise resource planning products, that whole thing was also a giant con. And for at least the first 5 years, it didn't work for anybody. And one of the great shorts was to short SAP's largest customers because they all failed miserably. There may be a massive investment play of shorting the people who make the greatest commitment to AI. It may be that not going to AI at all is the sensible business strategy. I don't know how long it's going to take for us to know the answer to that question. But the one thing I can tell you is if you look at it today, the productivity argument it is only there for a monopolist who gets rid of employees and accepts that their product is just going to work way less well for customers than it used to work. Anybody who's called a call center in the last few months knows that experience. And, if you take a look at it, whether it's in software programming, whether it's in, summarizing meetings or anything like that, the actual outputs are not very good. In things like search, it's a disaster. And, again, I think the thing that's really remarkable is that evidence doesn't matter. And so I think we're going to watch this thing play out. And it may play out in a way that has a soft landing for a whole bunch of people. At the moment, I would be cautious about trying to predict who those will be.
Well, as you put it, Roger, we are definitely on the ride now, for better or worse.
For better or worse, exactly.
Roger, talk soon. Thanks so much, Roger.
My pleasure. See you later.